The two-child benefit cap was introduced by George Osborne in 2017 as part of his austerity programme under the Cameron government. It stopped parents from receiving universal credit or claiming child tax credits for any more than their first two children. Recent research has shown that the cap has affected 1.5 million children. And rather than increasing employment, which is what Osborne promised, it's impoverished families. As a flagship Tory austerity policy, it seems like one that Labour would be keen to unpick. But here is what Keir Starmer, appearing on the BBC's Koonsberg on Sunday show, had to say about it.
So let's have a think then about a few specific things that Labour government you want to form would do. If you have more than two children at the moment, you don't get benefits. Would that change under a Labour government?
We're not changing that policy.
You're not changing the two-child policy benefits, OK.
The move is part of Labour's broader policy to prove that it is, how do I put this, fiscally responsible. Now, writing in The Guardian this weekend, Starmer pledged to rebuild broken Britain with reform, whatever that means, rather than spending. And in the article, Starmer goes on to say this. Many key indicators, including mortgage rates, show things are worse today than they were in the death days of the Truss government. But the mess we're in is symptomatic of a broader failure that spans the past 13 years. Only by sweeping away the entire failed Tory approach can we rebuild our country. But the hope that comes with the promise of a fresh start and a new way of doing things cannot be a code word for recklessness. Pointing at problems and promising vast sums of money to fix them has too often been the comfort zone of Labour oppositions and inevitably their final resting place. Of course, austerity is part of that failed Conservative approach, but it's a part that Starmer doesn't seem too keen on sweeping away, even when it comes to improving the lives of children. Starmer's announcement on the two-child policy puts him at odds with commitments some of his frontbenchers have made previously. Just last month, Shadow Work and Pensions Minister Jonathan Ashworth said this to the Mirror when asked about the cap. The former Conservative Welfare Minister David Freud described this as a vicious policy. He was absolutely correct to describe it as a vicious policy. We are very, very aware that this is one of the single most heinous elements of the system which is pushing children and families into poverty today. And in 2020, Shadow Deputy Leader Angela Rayner posted this on social media. The obscene and inhumane two-child cap must go, as must the 5-week wait. Rayner was responding to research published by The Guardian, showing that for many pregnant women, the two-child policy, quote, effectively removed their choice over the pregnancy, persuading them to end a pregnancy they would, in a less fraught financial situation, have wanted to keep. And this was Starmer himself in 2020. We must scrap the inhuman work capability assessments and private provision of disability assessments, e.g. ATOS, scrap punitive sanctions, two-child limit, and benefits cap. So let's just summarise what's changed here. According to Labour a little while ago, the two-child cap was heinous, obscene, inhumane, pushing families into poverty, and punitive. But now, it's perfectly acceptable, even fiscally responsible. On ITV's Good Morning Britain, Susanna Reid asked Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper this.
This is another U-turn, isn't it? And it's something that really could ease the cost of living crisis for thousands of families. Why has he changed his mind?
Well, you're right that the cost of living crisis is hitting families right across the country and people are really struggling. You've got mortgages going up now after the disastrous mini budget that we had last year. You've got people facing real pressure from rising food prices as well. What Labour's been clear about is we have to tackle the cost of living crisis, and we also will always make sure that the proposals we put forward are fully costed and funded so that we can actually deliver them. Okay. And I think that's what people want to see. They want to see the credible plans.
OK, well, what they need is an alternative plan, isn't it? And critics say this is a major driver of deepening poverty amongst low-income families. The Child Poverty Action Group says abolishing the cap would lift 250,000 children out of poverty and mean that a further 850,000 children would be in less severe poverty. If you, as the Labour Party, want to represent those people who are currently being left in poverty by a cap which seems to many people completely unfair to children, then that would be a policy that it would be worth pursuing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Keir Starmer thought it was something worth pursuing but then U-turned on it, just one of a number of U-turns he's done.
That wasn't the end of the conversation, though. Reid went on to also say this.
You are in the position, Yvette Cooper, of people who would naturally be drawn to the Labour Party now wondering what it stands for. You've got Mick Lynch, General Secretary of the RMT Union, saying that can no longer tell the difference between the Labour Party and the government. You're not sounding like an alternative party. One of the things he says is that he's not sure what the missions are. So the missions of the Labour Party haven't even got through to one of the senior leaders of one of the unions that backs you. Can you remind him and voters what Sir Keir Starmer's missions are?
So the missions are about getting the strongest growth in the G7. It's about cutting the most serious violent crime. It's about getting our NHS fit for purpose for the future. But the child poverty and helping kids get on in life is also a really part of it. Sorry, do you want the clean energy by 2030, and also smashing the class barriers in the education system so that our children can get on. And that also means tackling child poverty and reforming universal credit, supporting kids, supporting families for the future. There is a massive cost of living crisis facing people in the country as a result of the serious problems that this Tory government has left us with after 13 years. So sorry to interrupt you, Richard. I strongly do think there is a massive difference between Labour and the Tories, who have been in power for 13 years and left us with a country that just feels broken, where everything's gone backwards, everyone is worse off.
Why is Richard madly interrupting there instead of saying, where's the joined up thinking in this? If Keir Starmer's missions are, to break down the class barriers, to improve children's welfare, to improve the rates of child poverty in this country, and also improve employment rates, why on earth is he not getting rid of the benefit cap, which has been proven, as we've talked about earlier, not to get people into employment, but to impoverish families further and households, not to improve the fortunes of children in any way, shape or form? The welfare that we see, seeping into the education system, the burdens we see in the education system start at home. Children who are starving, children who are in households that live in poverty, bring that into the school, where the school is forced to provide for them as well on very, very scant resources. But instead, Richard Madley wants to interrupt and, talk about something else, and they're happy that Yvette Cooper can reel off a couple of Keir Starmer's missions, not going in on, where is the links between all these things? Why is there no holistic thinking about these policies instead of just saying we're going to be fiscally responsible, we're pursuing this growth agenda? There will be no growth if we are strangling the fortunes of children at such a young age. It makes absolutely no sense. And as we've said, this specifically makes children worse off, especially those who are already from poor backgrounds. This graph is from The Guardian, but based on research by the End Child Poverty Coalition. And as you can see in the richer areas, those to the left of the graph, hardly any children are affected by the cap. But if you move rightwards into more impoverished areas, the proportion of children affected by it, funnily enough, increases. In the poorest parts of Britain, nearly 30% of children feel the effect of the cap. Now, research has been published today into the impact of the 2-child limit as well as the benefits cap. The benefits cap was another Tory policy that was introduced in 2013, and it set a maximum for how much working-age households could receive in benefits, even if their entitlements are higher. Part of the larger family study with authors from Oxford, LSE and York universities, the research reveals this. Both policies disproportionately affect households with higher living costs, particularly households living in private rented properties and those with larger families, which in turn means they disproportionately affect minority ethnic households. The research also contains heartbreaking testimonials from parents on the effect of the 2-child limit on their families. Jessica has 4 children and is from Yorkshire. She said this: I couldn't even pay my gas, electric, council tax, rent. There wouldn't be enough money a month to even pay them, and that's without food and clothes for the kids. So I've just had to make the decision of I need to feed my children, I can't pay my council tax and my bills, and that's the decision I've had to make until hopefully I manage to get back to work. But that's kind of been dragged out of it because the more stressed and the worse my mental health gets, the longer I'm going to be off work for. And then there was also this testimonial from Alicia, who's from Yorkshire too. She has 5 children and she said this: my 9-year-old, a huge impact on him. Things like school photos. When school photos come round, he starts to panic because he wants a haircut. He daren't ask me. Cheapest haircut I can get from is about £10 or £11. I've tried doing clippers and stuff at home. No, it don't work. He's got very thick hair and he's 9. He wants to look nice. Things like their school uniform. If it wasn't for his school actually buying it this year, again, he's got quite anxious. He's a more shy child than my oldest, but he didn't have anxiety issues before. The Larger Families Study report concludes with this. Our evidence provides an overwhelming and, we would argue, unassailable case for the need to end both the two-child limit and the benefit cap, and to centre support for families with children in a much more positive light within the social security system. Now, some in the Parliamentary Labour Party have expressed their unhappiness with Starmer's latest U-turn. MP Meg Hillier told Westminster Hour this. Well, I was never comfortable about having the child benefit cap come in. Personally, I'd be lobbying for a lifting of that. Labour MP Stephen Timms chairs the Commons Work and Pensions Committee, and he told the newspaper this. The case for the two-child limit is not a strong one, and I've been interested to see Conservative MPs start to question the falling birth rate in this country. The limit as it currently stands only really makes sense if you think that families should not have more than 2 children, which I don't think people do think. As time goes on, the case for the two-child limit will be increasingly hard to make. Ash, is keeping the child benefit cap for a fiscally responsible future a Labour-owned goal?
Well, it's an own goal in more ways than just the narrow political sense, because alleviating child poverty is one of the single most effective policy interventions you can make as a government if you want to talk about all of the knock-on effects that you see because of it. So if you scrap the two-child cap for benefits, that will cost about £1.3 billion a year. As we've already mentioned, that would take 250,000 children out of poverty, and it would significantly alleviate the poverty of a further 850,000 children. So you're talking about a really significant economic intervention into the lives of well over 1 million children for the cost of £1.3 billion a year. That's not very much money for an excellent outcome, a really excellent policy outcome. And if you wanted to, you could pay for it by equalizing capital gains tax with income tax. So capital gains tax is a form of tax which you pay on investments. This isn't going to be something which is hitting people's monthly wage packets. It's something which disproportionately benefits much wealthier people because that's how they make their money. And you would get about 8 billion a year from that, if not more. So with those kinds of policy interventions where you go, okay, here's a way to make an intervention into the lives of children in poverty. We're going to do it not by hitting the pay packets of working people. We're going to do it by taxing wealth. It would be really, really straightforward. But you could also make the economic case for lifting those children out of poverty by thinking about all of those long-term benefits. So when you think about the way in which child poverty becomes an indicator for the need for other forms of state intervention, whether that's through child protective services, whether that's more support in schools, whether that's healthcare outcomes, which are negatively affected by children living in poverty, or whether that's the criminal justice system, because children in poverty are much more likely to find themselves sucked into the criminal justice system in some shape or form later in their lives, well, then you start thinking about the savings which are being made in other aspects of the state, particularly over the long term. And that's before you get to just a very simple moral case, which is what the two-child benefit cap did, was that it punished children for the circumstances that they were born into. And I remember doing media in 2017 when it was first introduced. I remember being on Politics Live with, I believe it was Toby Young, and he was talking about personal responsibility and how the state shouldn't pay people to have children and all this kind of nonsense. And at the core of that belief is that the poor are feckless, that they are reckless, they're not deserving of our help, they're out there breeding like rabbits. And so you have to punish the children to discourage the breeding, right? That is the ideology which is at the heart of the two-child benefit cap. And it is ugly. It is Victorian. And it's not something which belongs in any modern or civilized society. But thanks to 10 years of austerity, we're neither modern nor civilized. It is an own goal for Labour. I think that is a policy which is the opposite of fiscally or socially responsible. But what Keir Starmer is doing is that he's looking at his very sizable poll lead and he thinks he can be reckless with it. He thinks, well, the Tories are so bad, I don't necessarily have to be good. And as I've said many times, that's enough to perhaps secure you one term in government. Is it enough to secure you two? Is it enough to be the kind of prime minister that people talk about in terms of, eras? Clement Attlee being one. And this is the thing about fiscally responsible Labour governments. The most reckless ones have turned out to be the ones who didn't spend, who didn't invest, who didn't put that money into building institutions which made society a better place to live. The debt to GDP ratio was a lot higher coming out of World War II. We still fucking founded the NHS. So Keir Starmer's got neither the vision of Attlee nor the economic inheritance of Tony Blair. He's going to be, fucking damp fart in an ill-fitting suit, and then he'll complain about why people don't like him. And the party, unfortunately, I think will shift further to the right. The beatings will continue if morale doesn't improve.